Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Rika, and the conference organizer. And thank you to everyone who came out for the last session before the final keynote. It's been a very intense 2 days, but a really good 2 days. Thank you for everything you and everyone's done to make this happen. I'm going to jump right in to innovations in how we access the written word, which has always attracted skepticism. And this goes back to 370 BC, when Plato warned that the invention of writing will produce readers incapable of real judgment. He also said it would make people incredibly unpleasant to spend time with. Then we head to the 20th century, to interwar Britain. We have new print technologies that made a wider range of literatures available to a rapidly expanding reading public, whose tastes and preferences started driving the demand for mass-produced popular fiction. And what came out of this was a cultural war known as the Battle of the Brows. More recent panic about technology and reading, it's sort of centers around concerns about the effects of digital reading on critical thinking, attention and deep reading, and the effect of new social medias on reading, literary production, and again, a rapidly growing reading public, which was cultivated during the COVID-19 pandemic. This reading public is most visible on BookTok, one of the largest sub-communities on TikTok. And like their interwar counterparts, these reading masses or bookish communities have had a significant impact on the publishing industry. The Battle of the Brows, which has been relatively subdued until now, is re-entering discourse and seems to have been reinvigorated in unprecedented ways, with the term middle brow starting to pop up again to describe communities very much like those in the BookTok. It's widely accepted that the term middle brow was coined in the 1920s. Freeman's 1924 and Punch's 1925 definitions are most frequently cited, but I found earlier instances of the term in Sketch in 1920 and Bioscope in 1916. What is a constant in all scholarship on the middle brow is Virginia Woolf's definition, written in 1932 in a letter written but not sent to the editor of the New Statesman, where she defined the middle brow as of middle-bred intelligence, preoccupied with fame, money, and social esteem, lacking the authenticity of the low brow, which is a problem of its own, which we won't get into, and the intellectual refinement of the high brow. Woolf's sentiments are echoed in criticism of BookTok and the BookTok community, who are accused of the aesthetics and commercialization of reading, social capital, and middle brow novels over classic literature or canonical literature and deep critical reading. Whether explicitly stated or implied, the pattern that emerges in these critiques is that they correlate intellectual ability and reading practices. They posit that there's a right and a wrong way to read, and they assign value to the ability to distinguish between good and bad literature. And what should be preserved. And this is another really important thing. It's who gets to decide what is read and what is considered good and what is considered bad. And yeah, what should be discarded. These are all ideas that Woolf wrote about over the course of her career in essays that she compiled into 2 volumes of The Common Reader, both titled The Common Reader, Series 1, Series 2, which encouraged the development of a certain kind of reader. Her instructional method, although these essays weren't necessarily written to instruct, and in literary criticism, compiling them together created a kind of instructional body of work. Her method involved modeling best practice rather than explicitly telling the reader what to think. In the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, for example, she moves away from the sensory joy she experienced at the start of Sir Philip Sidney's prose pastoral romance to her loss of interest, which she justifies with an account of some of the deficits in writing, plus a characterization. In modern fiction, another essay, she does not overtly state her aversion to middle brow novels, but she uses the examples of H.G. Wells, John Galsworthy, and Arnold Bennett to sort of dog whistle her distaste for middle brow fiction. Woolf's common reader ultimately becomes an uncommon reader and differs from the reader that was common when she published the first series of The Common Reader in 1925, and the second in 1932, incidentally the same year that she writes Middlebrow. The first series begins with a reference to Samuel Johnson's Life of Gray, in which he describes the common reader as governed by common sense and uncorrupted with literary prejudices. In her interpretation of Johnson's idea, she moves from the common sense of readers to an instinct to create for himself. And the difference there is slight, but it's important. Instinct is an inherent aptitude or impulse in an individual. Common sense is socially, communally constructed and learned. The two common readers of Woolf's time, uncorrupted with literary prejudices, were the Middlebrow she despised. The common reader today, which I'll refer to as the new common reader, just so we can distinguish between all the common readers being thrown around, can be found on Book Talk. And they're driven to read by common sense, with the broad reading habits of Middlebrow, a category which I take to as positive. And I've integrated Beth Driscoll's 8 defining features of the Middlebrow throughout to illustrate this, with a focus on the Middlebrow as commercial, recreational, and more importantly, feminized and emotional. And this is because it isn't possible to talk about the Middlebrow or mass culture without talking about gender. Woolf was deeply critical of the Middlebrow version of what they had the impudence to call real humanity, this mixture of geniality and sentiment, stuck together with a sticky slime of calf's foot jelly. Like the interwar reading masses, new common readers and their reading habits are female and feminized. They are genial and sentimental. Women make up the majority of the Book Talk community, and they promote and consume novels dominated by women, and especially genre romance. And these women on Book Talk have noticed the gender bias in how the communities are being critiqued. This is Kahinda at Kahinda's library. And a quote from this particular video where she's talking about anti-intellectualism. I've seen a lot of debates on Book Talk and in the media, but the everlasting debate that keeps on showing up is anti-intellectualism and how Book Talk has ruined the publishing industry and ruined books. And whenever people talk about this, they often associate it to the romance genre, which really, really does annoy me, because I feel like the unnecessary hatred of the romance genre is rooted in internalized misogyny. This is Prof. Andrew Moore, who I spoke to for a while. He has a fantastic Book Talk channel, Great Books Prof. And he notes that the perceived threat to literature or the commodification of literature seems to take the form of woman reading. The implicit formula seems to be if too many women are interested in reading, it will somehow ruin literature. With over 2 billion registered users, the sheer volume of Book Talk content is distributed across For You pages inside and outside of that community, which not only makes what women are reading visible to the wider public, it shows through recordings of reader response and reviews how they are reading, and the emphasis that they place on emotional connections with literary works, in keeping with the sentimental tone of Middlebrow reading practices. And these emotional connections with literary works are central to the transfer between art and commerce in Middlebrow literary culture. Book Talk is implicated in commercial distribution networks, and it makes explicit the connection between writers, readers, and the intermediaries who present literary works to the public. The content in Book Talk is designed to elicit an emotional response from the viewer, urging them to read and buy the book. And this method has contributed to the growth in sales of trending genres. I think romantasy is very big at the moment, sort of hybrid splice genre. Publishing houses, sensing the commercial benefits of this approach, have capitalized on what Lindsay Thomas identifies as long-standing associations between consumer culture and femininity, and citing Sarah Brillette, the feminization of work in the publishing industry, where unpaid labor by readers and writers drives profits. Penguin Random House is a good example of this. They created a tagging feature where Book Talk reviewers or influencers could tag what they were reviewing, and then their watchers, viewers, would then click that link, which would take me to the website, where they'd find more videos, more content, and obviously a link to buy the book. And the way this was marketed was It was a play on readers' emotional engagement. They emphasized and the quote that it can be used to connect on a deeper level. So the idea that reading has become commercialized also goes hand in hand with the accusation that reading on Book Talk is a solely aesthetic activity. Claims that bookish communities are more concerned with the aesthetics of being a reader than actually reading are then supported with examples of videos showing content creators browsing bookstores, sharing book hauls, showing off new editions with pleasant covers, setting up reading nooks, or giving tours of well-stocked personal libraries. Jasmine Osadi attributes an increase in novels written and marketed as if they are made for Book Talk, manufactured to fit the specific audience and trends, to the aestheticization of reading, how it is depicted, but also in the fixation on certain trends in writing. But the idea that the commodification of books and the aestheticization of reading is a recent social media-driven phenomenon is, as with many of the critiques of Book Talk, a failure to sort of look back. And this weird idea that there was some sort of golden age of reading before that this came along and ruined it. Richard de Bury's-Villa Biblon, published in the 14th century, notes the pleasure of buying and owning books. Reading was aestheticized in paintings by Edward Manet, Alfred Stevens, Robert Delaunay, and others. Authors like Woolf were often photographed reading or writing, and in a study of marginalia in books owned and written by modernists, Amanda Golden finds that many had display copies of works to be seen and not read, like Evelyn Waugh's leather-bound edition of James Joyce's Ulysses. The mass production of books built around specific tropes is similarly not a recent phenomenon. Edith Maud Hull's Enemies to Lovers' Desert Romance, The Sheep, was reissued in 108 editions in Britain alone and sparked a deluge of desert romances. The popularity of the Enemies to Lovers trope, which was very central to this, is still very popular today. What is often overlooked is that trends form part of community building. The appeal of producing content that shows familiarity with bookish culture and aesthetics aligns with Andrew Piper's view that although we largely read in isolation today, we still wish for commonality when it comes to reading. He identifies three intersecting ideas that I think work quite well for illustrating what brings bookish communities together. So commonality, we want other people to read the same thing we are reading. Transferability, we want to be able to send other people what we are reading. And sociability, we want to be able to talk to other people about what we are reading. Piper notes that reading is never purely an act of isolation. When we read, we enter into a world of commonality, whether of language, story, or material object. Reading socializes because we form social bonds through our reading material. And the majority of content created on the book is not created by authors, publishers, distributors, or even influencers, but by new common readers who want to talk about what they're reading. And contrary to the prevailing narrative, this includes canonical literature and critically acclaimed contemporary works. This is Trish Parkinson. She's a speech pathology student, and she reads classic fiction because it's foundational to the books we have today, in her words, and popular fiction because it's a great way to unwind. And she will review books like Woolf's A Room of One's Own with the same care and consideration as Evie Dunmore's popular historical romance, A Robe of One's Own. Readers like Trish are reverential because a veneration for elite culture underpins all activities of the literary middle brow. But that veneration does not determine the limits of their reading habits or their common sense opinions of literature. The shift in how new common readers engage with and drive reading and publishing, coupled with the instability of a corporatized academy, has forced literary critics like Derek Attridge and John Guillory to consider the urgent question, what is the role of the academic literary critic in the fostering and diffusion of literature? And what is the social relevance of what is effectively becoming an increasingly inward-turning profession? The concerns that they raise emerge from debates steeped in what Erica Brown and Mary Grover have identified as the powerful anxieties about cultural authority and processes of cultural transmission that informed the invention of middlebrow as a cultural category. In simple terms, Book Talk is treading where it's not welcome. Its content creators are usurping the academic literary critic, the literary scholar, and the well-educated reviewer. And to add insult to injury, their literary practices are those of the middle brow, amateur, recreational, and defined outside and often against the academy. On BookTok, books spanning the literary spectrum are brought together in an informal, community-constructed literary canon that diverges from the traditional literary canon. And this unsettles the divide between highbrow and middlebrow by giving the literature associated with these categories, so mass popular fiction, canonical fiction, equal weighting. BookTok is also steadily developing its own counter-academy to complement its canon, with educational content by creators, academic and amateur, like Prof. Moore, who's an academic taking an outward-turning approach. And he uses BookTok to advocate for the humanities, this is a quote, and demonstrate the value of humanistic inquiry to a general audience. In response to the conflict between the intellectual and the new common reader, Moore argues that energizing readers is good for the humanities. How could it not be? English literature departments probably do more to ruin literature than BookTok does. Which brings us back to Woolf. In writing, she was a lot more open-minded. Woolf seems to change considerably between 1916 and 1932. She becomes a little more pessimistic, I think. And by the time she writes Little Brow, her views have changed in terms of how things should be read, what should be read, changed quite considerably. In Hours in the Library, it's an essay that she did not include in the common reader. She that much more closely resembles the new common reader today. And they are young, they're engaged, and they're engaging in a process of positive, disinterested reading and self-education.
For the first time, perhaps, all restrictions have been removed. We can read what we like. Libraries are at our command. And, best of all, friends who find themselves in the same position. Here we have written down the names of great writers in their order of merit. Here we have copied out fine passages from the classics. Here are lists of books to be read. And here, most interesting of all, lists of books that have actually been read. There is a sort of wonderment in our minds that we ourselves are really doing this, and mixed with it an absurd arrogance and desire to show our familiarity with the greatest human beings who have ever lived in the world. Thus to stand in a great bookshop crammed with books, so new that their pages almost stick together, and the gilt on their backs is still fresh, has an excitement no less delightful than the old excitement of the second-hand bookstall. But if we need all our knowledge of the old writers in order to follow what the new writers are attempting, it is certainly true that we come from adventuring among new books with a far keener eye for the old, and with eyes clear of prejudice can judge more truly what it is that they are doing, and what is good and what bad.
Woolf could not have predicted the exact shape that the 21st century common reader would assume, but she did predict the important role that they would play in the fostering and diffusion of literature. And her literature is among the great works that BookTok is preserving in its canon, with more than 7.1 million posts tagged #Virginia Woolf, in which content creators discuss her work, share quotes, and express their love for both fiction and nonfiction. The real risk to literature is not social media or the new common reader. It's repeating the mistakes of critics past. The way that literature was coded in the interval period has left gaps in scholarship on literary production. And although work is underway to address this with categories like Tristan Emails into Modernism, it seems unlikely that all of those lost works, many by women in the working classes, will be recovered or recognized. The most important way that the new common reader differs from the critic and the scholar is that they do not limit themselves to what they are told is great literature and are more likely to stumble upon books sidelined because of genre or because they're popular on BookTok, which is a big way that people determine whether or not to read something now. If BookTok is like it, we don't look at it. In addition, and this is probably even more important, the constant barrage of criticism leveled at this community could discourage reading, and it could discourage those who might have gone onto it to find recommendations, but now aren't. And I've seen this a lot. If you mention book talk to anyone on the university campus, they kind of make the face and shy away, like, oh, I'd never go on that. Because it's become a cultural marker. It's creating this divide between the common reader and the intellectual. In 1917, Woolf addressed this approach to cultivating a taste for literature, and the approach being finding your ways to the greats through just pure enjoyment of reading, even if that meant reading bad books. And she spoke about this in dialogue with her husband, Leonard Woolf, broadcast on the BBC. And she was responding to his concerns about mass production of literature and what people were reading by describing a situation that looks a lot like our own. Millions of human beings of both sexes of all ages have now been admitted to the whole of literature. Naturally, they make a rush for the sweets and cakes first, for the easy books and the flashy books and the books that ask no trouble in reading. As people read more books, they will read better books. They will also realize the pleasure of owning the books they read. Book talk readers have shown that they can engage with the read of literature, even those who are not formally trained. A few examples: at in Lara Land praises A Rogue of One's Own for its implicit feminism, while noting the flaws in how Dunmore writes people of colour. At Kinder's Library recommends Sally Rooney's Normal People for its underlying critique of capitalist dehumanization and exploitation. And at Hayes Franklin reads Wolf's Orlando as an early proto-queer genderqueer novel. To date, sustaining the battle of the brows has done little to alleviate anxieties about processes of cultural transmission or to curtail the reading habits of new common readers or the reading masses. And they are the 21st century reading masses, feminized, marginalized, and placed in opposition to a highbrow minority. But moving past these debates is only possible if a truce is called, an outward-turning approach to literary studies and criticism is adopted, and how readers and their reading preferences are categorized and critiqued is revived. And this is a revision that includes a more nuanced and considerate engagement with the new common reading public, and how the new common reader contributes to literary culture, not from a liminal space betwixt and between, but as an equal and valuable participant in its production. Thank you.